Thank you very much. Thank you to Dr. Lampa for inviting me to be here, and I'm delighted to be on the panel with so many distinguished speakers who really laid the table for what I would like to talk about. First of all, 2 words about Bioversity International. We are a member of the CGIR, International Research Network, and our strategic objectives are basically to ensure that we are increasing the use of agricultural biodiversity in our consumption systems, in our production systems, in our seed systems, and also that we are safeguarding that agricultural biodiversity for future generations. So first of all, just a little overview of what I'd like to talk about. I'm going to try to bring in some examples of the work that we do in other countries that might be of interest to the audience here in terms of thinking through the kinds of policies and programs that India might want to adopt and adapt over time. So first of all, before I start, what is agricultural biodiversity? Because this is a concept that many people think they understand. This is based on the FAO definition of agricultural biodiversity. It is a subset of the universe of the living system that we have, that we use to ensure we have food production. So it includes the genetic diversity that we're all familiar with, I think we think about, first of all, of our agricultural system, but it also goes up to the ecosystem level. We also talk about soil biodiversity, we talk about pollinator biodiversity. So it is in fact a very large concept. It is every living thing that helps us produce our food. So previous speakers have already mentioned the fact that in the last century, our compelling challenge was of ensuring that people had sufficient calories. And India, of course, was one of the ground springs of the Green Revolution, and it was quite successful, as many people have pointed out, and as we all know, in terms of producing sufficient agricultural food, increasing the productivity of the major staple grains in a number of countries. And as a result of that, combined with economic growth, poverty levels have gone down. So in many ways, we succeeded in addressing the challenge that we faced in the 21st century, in the 20th century. Today, however, the challenges that we face are much more complicated, much more complex, and much more interrelated. So in addition to still having the challenge of energy deficiency, raw hunger in about 800 million people, we still face, on top of that, micronutrient deficiencies and obesity, which have been mentioned and are the theme of this Congress. But we know we have additional challenges coming from climate change, which is not only going to reduce yields in a number of places, it's also going to change the production patterns and disrupt farmers' livelihoods, and it also will affect the nutrient content of a number of our crops. Finally, we are suffering in many parts of the world, India included, from increasing land degradation. Land degradation, desertification are affecting 1.5 billion people around the world, and 90% of those who are living in low-income countries. So these challenges are interrelated, and they need to be resolved in an interrelated way. So we're all aware, I think, of the simplification of our food system. I like this particular diagram here because it really hits home how narrow our food system has become. We know of about 7,000 crops that have been used for food, human food, throughout history. And yet 3, rice, maize, and wheat, account for more than 50% of the calories that we get from plants. And even when you include some additional plants and animal species, we still rely on a very, very narrow part of our food system for the calories and energy that we receive. But unfortunately, we aren't growing enough of the other crops that we need for human health. So this diagram is certainly showing at a global level that we don't grow enough vegetables, we don't have enough fruit, nuts, and seed, and that at a global level we're overproducing red meat, whole grains, and fish. There was a recent study that was released that said that if every person tried to consume what the dietary guidelines recommend to us, we would fall 22% short of the amount of fruits and vegetables that we're producing. And this, of course, is more of a challenge in many developing countries where it could be as much as 50% shortfall. Raj Shah, who's now the president of the Rockefeller Foundation, but used to be head of agriculture at the Gates Foundation, noted that in the US, in my home country, subsidies for cereal crops mean that only about 2% of the cropland is dedicated to growing fruits and vegetables. And I want to mention here the importance of policy. A number of years ago, the United States Department of Agriculture produced a study that looked at what would American agriculture look like if we produced according to the dietary guidelines that our health services are recommending. And of course, the production system is completely upside down. We are not producing enough fruits, vegetables, we are overproducing grains because of the subsidy regimes. And I think this is important as you're deliberating in the next few days about the importance of policy in driving the kinds of changes we need. So basically, we are looking around the world at diets that are very heavily based on staples and on a few, and in some cases, not very nutritious vegetables. These photographs, one from India, one from Kenya, show a diet that is lacking in important micronutrients, vitamins, and minerals that are definitely missing from the diet. And I'm thinking if we could put a picture of a US diet up there, it would be maybe a plate of French fries and a hamburger on a white bread bun, and that would be the diversity in the American food system, with a can of Coca-Cola on the side. So how do we move from the kinds of diets, the simplified diets that I just showed, to this more diversified diet? First of all, we know that traditional foods are increasingly being recognized as healthy, sustainable, and cost-effective alternatives to micronutrient deficiencies that we see around the world. They're often less expensive. They are better adapted and friendlier to the environment in which they're being grown and in which they're being consumed. These crops are often more resistant to pest and disease and providing more vitamins, minerals than are commonly consumed in these very simplified diets. So the solution that Bioversity proposes, and the one that we are researching around the world, is that we need to deploy these 7,000 species of crops as strategic assets in terms of reducing micronutrient malnutrition. I want to call attention to a study that Bioversity and FAO just released that showed that 93% of over 1,000 cultivated vegetable species that we've identified in Africa and Southeast Asia are under-researched. We often talk about underutilized crops or neglected crops or orphan crops. But I want to really emphasize, especially that we're sitting here in a research institute, that the issue is that these crops, these foods are under-researched. The amount of funding that we have to actually understand the nutrition, understand the production systems for these high-density crops is really shockingly low. So what are recipes for success? How do we address these situations? So one of the initiatives that Bioversity, research programs that Bioversity has is in Benin. And this is a 6-year study in 2 communities in Benin where we see very high rates of malnourishment. this initiative has basically been researching how we can use locally available diverse foods to improve nourishment in children aged 6 to 23 months, so just in that period of first foods that was previously mentioned. So we realized in this research that basically 35% of these children were not eating diets, were not being fed diets that met dietary requirements. They were not consuming foods across the 7 food groups that you would like to see to make sure a child has the kind of healthy diets that are being recommended by the governments. These diets that the children were eating were very high in energy-dense foods, but low in calcium, iron, zinc, and not much in the way of animal-sourced foods. So at the same time we were studying the diets and the nutrition of these children in these communities in Benin, we were also looking at how we can actually fill nutrition gaps from the local environment. So we've mapped locally available foods, 146 plant species and 148 animal species that were available in the local production system or in local markets. We then, using mathematical modeling, we identified the dietary combinations that would optimize filling these nutrient gaps that we were seeing in our earlier survey by swapping out or changing ingredients in traditional recipes. And then we went one step further to actually test these recipes in the communities, because it's all well and good to sit and look at a mathematical model that says you should be substituting cabbage for spinach, for example, but if people won't eat it, it's meaningless. So we've actually been working directly with these communities to change recipes, to test these recipes, and ensure acceptability of these kinds of food recommendations. So in addition, we've also undertaken a very significant effort to increase the nutrition literacy of the community members. And we're looking at a number of different initiatives, including videos, posters, leaflets, recipe books, which is actually leading to changes in how people are eating. It's particularly useful, and I think having high impact with mothers who are concerned about the nutrition of their children. And that concern not only translates to improving nutrition for their children, but of course improving nutrition for the entire family. So this is an example of a food calendar that we are developing. This one in particular here is from Guatemala. This is a seasonal food calendar. We have looked month by month at the crops that are available either in the local production system or in the local market, and identified what nutrient gaps these crops are filling. We've done similar work as this seasonal food calendar in other countries, including here in India, Kenya, Malawi, Mali, Mexico, Vietnam, and Zambia, and we will be releasing one in Nigeria. And I think this is a very useful concept because it really relates back to what people are seeing in their local markets and helping them understand how and when they can integrate those foods into their diet to improve their children's nutrition. So just for example, one of the target crops in Guatemala is an evergreen shrub called chaya, which has been used by the people, Mesoamerican people, since pre-Columbian times. It's very adapted to the dry corridor, which in that region, and it's very nutritious in containing high amounts of vitamin A, protein, niacin, and vitamin C. But this is a crop that has been falling out of use because of lack of knowledge about its benefits and lack of support and encouragement from the governments. So we do need to have supportive food policies in order to encourage consumption of local foods and diversified diets. And again, quoting quoting Raj, global food policies must encourage the production of a diverse range of foods that are naturally rich in vitamins and minerals that people need to be healthy. So in 2 communities in Vietnam, Bioversity has been in partnership with Food Plant Solutions and World Relief to basically start increasing support and enthusiasm for diversified food production in the school feeding programs there. This is allowing children in the schools to be empowered with knowledge, with meals and skills that will continue to help them throughout their life and the life of their families going forward. So I want to talk about a program of work that we have done in Brazil with support of the Global Environmental Facility called Biodiversity for Food and Nutrition. We've also been enacting a similar approach in Turkey, Kenya, and Sri Lanka. So, like India, Brazil is a middle-income country, very rapidly developing, but still has high rates of malnutrition. And despite, again, like India, being a mega-diverse country, the country has no more than 10 consolidated native foods on its markets. So most of the food Brazilians are consuming are actually exogenous foods such as coffee, soy, maize, sugarcane, cotton, and oranges, and tobacco. So the first thing we did in working with Brazil in this JEF project is that we characterized 73 species, local species, for their nutrient content. One of those, in the picture I showed in the previous slide, is called camu camu, which has 35 times more vitamin C than oranges, which are not native to Brazil. When I've showed that picture before of that great orange fruit to Brazilians, they don't even know what it is. Yeah? And this is native species and indigenous species, and such a powerful nutrient. The second step was working with Brazil to establish a school feeding program. So this has meant basically working with the schools to begin incorporating these indigenous fruits and vegetables into the school feeding program, providing healthy meals to kids that provide at least 20% of their nutritional needs during the school year. And this is importantly reaching 40 million students who are future consumers. And I think this is very important because we learn our food habits when we are young, and we learn them not just at home, but also at schools. And these kids can bring these new programs, new ideas, new foods back into their home community. The third step was to establish a food procurement program. And this is building on existing policies that were in Brazil, but working with Brazil, we were able to add additional requirements that 30% of the government would pay more for foods that were organically produced or agroecologically produced food, and that prioritize the use of indigenous food and indigenous community farmers in the school feeding program. So this has also created a market, and I think this is the other important piece of this. It's, again, all well and good for us to say we should be eating a more diversified diet, but if farmers don't see a real market for that, they will not produce. So we were able, through establishing this food procurement program, to create that kind of market system. And this is encouraging diversification on the farms, which is also having an impact on the farmers' resilience against drought and other pests and disease, in addition to climatic impacts. So step 4, just like we have done in Benin and these other communities I mentioned before, we increased awareness of how biodiversity can contribute to food and nutrition through weekly farmers markets, cultural demonstrations, and a variety of other outreach tools. I understand from our India office here that there's going to be a food fair in Bihar next week, I think it is, that is going to be demonstrating the importance and value of wild foods and cultivate and diversity foods there. And a couple of years ago when I was visiting India, I attended a diversity fair in Raipur. So India is already doing many of these kinds of outreach activities and awareness raising activities. And step 5 of this program that we worked on quite closely with Brazil was to introduce an ordinance on socio-biodiversity. And this was a public policy that was signed by the Brazilian Ministry of Environment and Social Development. So again, very important. We worked with multiple ministries. I think at one time 13 different ministries and sub-ministries were involved, all changing their regulations to support greater diversity in their food system. So, in a couple of concluding remarks, I just want to make the link between the foods that we eat and the planet. Right now, our production systems are not only affecting our diets and reducing our nutritional capacity, but we're also pushing the planetary boundaries with our current production systems. Most directly in biodiversity loss, which I mentioned at the beginning of my remarks, but also in expanding or increasing our nitrogen use to the point where it is hurting our water systems and degrading our land. We also know clearly we have a crisis of climate, which is fed to some extent by our food system. According to some studies, about between 20 and 25% of total greenhouse gas emissions now come from our agricultural sector. Agriculture is the largest user of fresh water, and of course rain will fall and falls on crops as well as on our cities, but we're also using so much water now that we're undermining our water basins, and I think this is very important, and particularly in a time when we have less predictable climates due to climate change. So this is a fairly complicated graph, but let me just pull out a couple of numbers. So this basically is a model projecting what would happen if we continue to eat based on the income levels that we're seeing out to 2050. So in terms of greenhouse gas emissions, which is the colored chart, colored bar chart there, currently our food system, we're emitting about 300 kilograms per person per year of greenhouse gases. If we solely continue to eat based on our income and what the projections say about as people move up the income ladder, more westernized diets, etc., the greenhouse gas emissions from our diet would go to 400 kilograms per person per year. If we maintain a vegetarian diet, like many people in India have, greenhouse gas emissions in 2050 would only be 200, so half of what we would project. Even a Mediterranean diet, which is where Bioversity is based in Rome, you would maintain your current levels of greenhouse gas emissions. We see similar results in terms of the land that we use, and we all know the world is not making more land, and in fact with climate change we're probably ending up with less land. So to the extent we can change our diets and reduce our environmental footprint and achieve better nutrition, this is the direction we believe we should go. Now I'm going to conclude with how do we get there. So I've talked a lot about policies, I've talked a lot about school kids, school feeding programs, increasing our research, but we need to look at using agricultural biodiversity in a very integrated fashion. And amazingly enough, despite the importance that we attach to agricultural biodiversity in the Sustainable Development Goals or in the Convention on Biological Diversity or in our national policies, we actually have no way to measure it. So Bioversity International has developed an agricultural biodiversity index, which looks at ag biodiversity in markets and consumption and production systems, and then our genetic resources systems. It looks at the commitments, the actions, and the results, the status, both at the country level, but also for companies, and also can be used to look at specific interventions, specific projects. I'm proud to say that India is one of the pilot countries for this index and helping us develop it. We're going to be deploying it in one of the states quite soon. I had good conversations with the Indian government about this quite recently. And basically this will allow countries to benchmark themselves about how they're doing towards increasing agricultural biodiversity in these systems and learn from each other about best practices. So finally, to quote from your Prime Minister, this was at the World Agrobiodiversity Congress that occurred in New Delhi 2 years ago. In a true sense, we have with us a treasure of valuable agrobiodiversity we have not yet explored. So I'm happy to announce that the next World Agrobiodiversity Congress will be held in Rome, in Italy, in 2020, and we'll be following on the great legacy that was laid in India here 2 years ago to continue to promote agricultural biodiversity in our food system. So thank you all very much.